Dr. Tom, this happened so quickly. A Supreme Court justice afraid to define the word woman. 5 years ago, everyone would have laughed at the thought, but here we are. These were once just little changes at first, it seems to me, that somehow took over the entire country. My father, your uncle, he had a saying. In life, the first warning is a tap on the shoulder. The second is a punch in the face. Well, we went from laughing at these people to having to defend ourselves from them.
Yeah, I know, but my godfather's observation holds true on the streets of South Philly. But no, Rob, it happened very slowly. It's just that it has reached a critical mass within our lifetime and appears like a rapid expansion to us, okay? Because we went from one extreme to the other within our lifetime. It was recognizable. Well, here's your punch in the face. Yes, we're going to have to fight on every front. Education, news, sports, even entertainment, to get the country back now. And it's not going to be easy. Remember episode 18 when we discussed the psychology of totalitarianism? Here's a perfect example where a small portion of the population can form around an ideology and then take over a society. Right now, for instance, those who question the changes we see happening are labeled, ridiculed, marginalized, censored, their careers destroyed. They and their families are threatened with violence. So much for tolerance. Ask your liberal friends if these are the actions of true liberals. Ask them if they would do it. How do you think they would respond?
America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 23 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. What conservative and liberal Americans don't realize about themselves. Have you ever asked yourself why today's politicians and even the citizenry of our country seem to constantly be at each other's ideological throats? Well, in this episode, Dr. Tom and I are going to explore the political divide and the reasons why the left and right paradigm is so polarized in American politics. We're also going to try to identify the actual source of the animus and how society at large is duped into choosing sides. Hi, Dr. Tom.
Yo, Rob, how's it going?
Good, good. Or as they say in Italian, va bene.
Va tutto bene, sì. Ma non tutto bene, va bene, va abbastanza bene.
Tutto bene. Okay, I'm trying to find a way to avoid cringing at what's going on in our country. Sometimes I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Other than that, everything's going fine.
Yeah, I gotcha. I've been watching it from here. But don't think that the U.S. has a monopoly on absurdity, though. Watching what we're constantly bombarded with is like we're living in a Fellini film, especially when you're on to their game.
Okay, well, let's begin. I've spent a fair amount of time reflecting on the state of our country. I don't think anyone can claim it's a conspiracy theory to acknowledge that we are divided on almost every topic. Now, we're going to look into the underlying reasons for that later, but before we do, I think a good place to start our discussion would be to define left and right. These are two sides that we're told are on the field. Where did these political terms come from?
Well, first of all, we sometimes think of ourselves as Democrats and Republicans. We're individuals in America with a certain set of values. Democrats and Republicans are members of a political party. Unless you're a politician, you can't claim that mantle. You may claim to lean conservative or liberal, but getting back to the point, if you think about it, the very nature of a democratic government implies opposing points of view on how a society should be governed and how and why decisions should be made. This goes all the way back to the Greek polis in the late Bronze Age. If you take away a king or a tyrant whose decision-making was based on perpetuating power within a small group of elites or through a royal dynasty, What is left is decision-making by compromise. The discourse has always been the Greek dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or what I see, what you see, and what we see together. So division has always been with us, but the major reasons for the opposing propositions usually followed rules or guidelines with some fundamental common ground. That is love of country or the best interests of society from which you come.
So you're saying that political divides have been with us from the time civil societies began to organize.
Oh, even before. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that there were opposing points of view within clan and tribal structures, even before that.
I can accept that, but what about these terms that we use today? Where did they come from specifically?
In today's America, the terms left-wing and right-wing are symbolic labels for Marxist-based political ideologies in all their forms and conservatives. But they were originally coined in reference to the physical seating arrangements of politicians during the French Revolution. Their political divide dates to the summer of 1789, when members of the French Assemblée Nationale met to begin drafting a constitution. The delegates were deeply divided over the issue of how much authority King Louis XVI should be permitted. With the continuing polarization, the two main factions each staked a claim to territory in the Assembly Hall. The anti-royalist revolutionaries seated themselves to the presiding officer's left. They were liberals or Jacobins. On the right side, the more conservative aristocratic supporters of the monarchy gathered. This separation of factions continued during the early 1790s, when French newspapers began making reference to the progressive left and the traditionalist right of the French Assembly. These distinctions disappeared after Louis and Marie Antoinette were guillotined, and for several years during the reign of Napoleone Bonaparte. They reappeared with the Bourbon Restoration after the Treaty of Vienna and the reinstitution of the constitutional monarchy in 1815. Now, liberal and conservative representatives once again took up their respective posts on the left and right of the legislative chamber. By the mid-19th century, the terms left and right became ingrained in the French vernacular as a kind of ID tag for opposing political ideologies. Political parties even began self-identifying as center-left, center-right, extreme left, and extreme right, indicating sub-factions with shared interests. So France's left and right labels filtered out to the rest of the world during the 1800s, but they weren't common in English-speaking countries until the early 20th century. The terms are now used to describe opposing ends of the political spectrum, and their origins are still evident in the seating arrangements in many legislative bodies. In the U.S. Congress, for example, Democrats and Republicans traditionally sit on opposite sides of the House and Senate chambers. This terminology, however, really clouds the true issues of how people in government believe our society should be organized and run. Even the words left and right have an inherent meaning to English-speaking people that informs a moral underpinning.
How is that? Where did the words themselves originate, and what were their meanings in common English?
Well, without going into the entire etymology of the words, right has a traditional meaning of being morally correct or just, good, fair, proper, fitting, and straight, let's say. The Greek orektos means stretched out and or upright, and in Latin, rectus means right or straight. Left, on the other hand, is from the Old English lift, meaning weak or foolish, lame, twisted, or crooked, even worthless. We still use these meanings in common speech. The Latin sinister for left also has obvious connotations in English, as does the root word dexter for right.
Yes, in Italian, sinistra, left.
Right, right. It's sinistro or sinistra, and destro or destra.
Thanks for helping me with my Italian, Dr. Tom.
Non ci sono problemi. Quando vuoi. A tua disposizione. Non ci sono problemi.
Okay, I've got all that, or at least some of it. But today it's hard to have a conversation with anyone on the other side of the political divide. And without commonality, you can't communicate because you're always having to go back and define terms. And if you don't agree on basic definitions, it's hard to agree on anything, really. In the words of Rodney King, can't we all just get along?
Yeah, all just get along. Well, you do have to share basic principles in order to do that, no? All communication requires an intention to pass ideas on the one side and an attention to receive them on the other. All communication is a contract by definition. In other words, an offer and an acceptance. How can you communicate if one side doesn't even want to hear the other, and at the same time wants to force communication on you? Today, communication is becoming a lost art and is severely lacking. Another problem befuddling the American public is the redefinition of terms to fit the Marxist narrative and political objectives. They have taken over the terms of the debate and framed them to attain their own ends.
Dr. Tom, you're gonna need to expound on that a bit.
Okay, well, let's look back at America's founding. Back then, the founding fathers were a mix of classical liberals and conservatives. But you have to ask, what were the conservatives trying to conserve? And what did the liberals want to enshrine? Right? These people were divided into basically two camps, the anti-federalists and the federalists. Now, don't be confused. This was not a reflection of their views on the federal form of government. It was a contrast of what they wanted the federal government to encompass. The Federalists wanted to create a strong central government, which basically mirrored what they had just cast off. There was even talk of creating a new monarchy. They didn't want to specifically spell out the restraints on the government, nor to list the Bill of Rights, claiming that they were already implied throughout the document that they had drafted, ratified, and enacted. The Anti-Federalists disagreed, claiming that people, by their very nature, could not be trusted to maintain the spirit of individual freedoms and government restraint if they were not specifically enumerated. Checks and balances on power can only work if you know what to check and how to balance. This argument was eventually quelled with the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in 1791. Now, listen very closely, okay? Because here is where things get muddled in terms of today's politics and the Marxist tactic of redefining terms to fit their destructive agenda comes into play. When we speak of conservative values today, we are referring to maintaining the classical liberal values enshrined in the Constitution: small government, minimal taxes, minimal regulations governing our lives and property, individual freedoms and liberties, and placing the individual's rights at the heart of government activity. Liberal means just that, anything favoring the liberty of the individual.
Well, Dr. Tom, if that's true, why are liberals today generally voting for more government, more spending, more taxes, less freedoms?
Well, because the term has been stolen. The term has been usurped by the Marxists and no longer has its original meaning. Today, people are confused by the terms liberal and leftist, and the confusion is intentional. True liberalism is the complete opposite of Marxist ideologies, but you would never know it by the way people interpret them today. This is the result of a careful Marxist execution of subtle and not so subtle indoctrination through a corrupted education system, entertainment, mass media, and now big tech. Most conservatives today identify Marxism with liberalism, and most liberals insultingly equate American conservatism with fascism and Nazism. It only takes a superficial inspection to realize that these were European Marxist political philosophies. They were socialists, and they were as Marxist in their goals as Lenin's or Stalin's communism was. In other words, simply equating a socio-political worldview to a physical position in a parliamentary hall means nothing. Thomas Jefferson, had he been in France during their revolution, would have been on the left. Madison and Hamilton would have been on the right.
So you mean that the terms are really geographically significant depending on where you are rather than absolute in terms of politics. So in America, conservative meant one thing, and in France it meant another?
Exactly. It all depends on what you're trying to conserve. Today's Europe is practically entirely based in Marxism, and the distinction between left and right is absolutely meaningless. They're both Marxian. Just like their view on economics is only confined to the notions of Marx and John Maynard Keynes. Any naysaying on the part of socialists is mere deception and delusion. I remember seeing an Italian socialist politician a few years back arguing on TV till the veins in his neck bulged that Hitler wasn't a socialist. You know, how dare you associate my party with Hitler? Reminding him that Hitler's party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party fell completely on deaf ears. Socialist is in the name, yet he ignored that and focused his attention on national, as though the reasons for the horrors of Hitler's and Mussolini's regimes was nationalism. You know, is it any wonder that the goal of the European Union is to eliminate sovereign national states rather than socialism? Is it any wonder that the governance of the European Union is an international Soviet system? It is communism writ large. Ask Nigel Farage.
Well, I'd ask him if he was here.
And he'd tell you.
I never thought about it that way. You know, here's what I think I know. Right after World War II, when the horrors of socialism and Marxism were finally exposed for all of us to see, it became apparent that those ideologies should finally be stamped out and sent to the dustbin, or so we thought. So now you're saying that they view the problem of the wars in the last century as a function of national identity rather than the consequences of Marxist ideology?
That's exactly what the European people have been convinced of by the Marxists. It's pure deflection from the truth. Nationalism is merely an interest in the well-being of your homeland. Gandhi was a nationalist. Nelson Mandela was a nationalist. So was Churchill. In the U.S., Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson were nationalists. Nationalism was never the problem. Socialism was, and still is. Why do you think the French politicians have never forgiven us for liberating them from themselves?
Whoa, Dr. Tom, I thought the French were thankful. Why do you think they're not?
Rob, where do you think postmodernism came from? It was born in France. It's a communist offshoot born in France to support the Hegelian dialectic. Yes, they were thankful in the 40s through the 60s, you know, after the war, when they needed American dollars to rebuild. The French people are generally grateful. You know, they're thankful. But today, you know, the French have returned to socialism, the very ideology from which we saved them. Some of their politicians have called to exhume the dead American soldiers from their soil for polluting their land. How would you interpret that?
Well, back to America.
Okay.
You know, Dr. Tom,
I would prefer it.
I had a conversation with someone a while back, and I was sort of lamenting that a lot of my friends are liberals, and we do share values. We love our country, but there's not much remaining that we can agree on, even talk about. Here's an example, Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, love him or hate him, that's not the point anymore. He's become a symbol. One of my liberal friends was ecstatic with glee over the fact that Trump was finally indicted. He said Trump deserved what was coming. Well, I asked him, did Trump deserve the phony Russian collusion investigation, or maybe the first impeachment or the second impeachment? No answer from him. But, in that conversation, he didn't appear in the least concerned about the precedent a presidential indictment sets for the future of our country. You see, all that mattered was getting Trump from the very beginning when his hand hit the Bible. So, we finally criminalized politics, just like every other banana republic. So my question to you, what's changed to bring this about?
Sad. But all of this is because your liberal friend is confused. A true liberal would be appalled at the government establishment's treatment of Mr. Trump. Only a Marxist would take pleasure at these lame attempts to take Trump down, and with him the aspirations of his pro-American supporters. So your friend has to take stock with what he is espousing and just what he is. If you were to ask him outright if he is a communist, a socialist, a Nazi, or a fascist, or any other form of Marxist, permutation of Marxism, what would he say? I guarantee you that he would be insulted at the suggestion, never questioning or never realizing that what he's endorsing is leftist tactics to destroy a political opponent.
That begs the question. What do you think about this obvious weaponization of the justice system against Trump? I mean, I know you're a Trump supporter.
Oh, I am an unapologetic Trump supporter. Okay. But, these people, they have to be careful because these things can come back and bite them in the ass. But let's say I weren't a Trump supporter. Let's say I was completely indifferent about Trump. And let's look at this even closer, okay? It is obvious to anybody watching that anti-Trumpers, both in the Democrat and Republican parties, don't want him to run in 2024. So they raid his home in violation of his Fourth Amendment guarantees. They accuse him of crimes that are not crimes under the Presidential Archives Act, okay? As commander-in-chief, he is the sole executive decision maker on what is and what isn't classified material and can do with it whatever he wishes. There is even a precedent in law with how Bill Clinton handled supposed classified material when he left the office, when he left the Oval Office. So the accusations are a complete sham with an underlying political agenda. So are any of the other charges based upon that unlawful predicate. The fruit of a poison tree. In their aim to besmirch his name, as they have tried and failed to do throughout his first term, to turn voters against him, it ain't working. His support is exploding. Even if he were to be convicted of a crime, bogus or otherwise, it still cannot exclude him from running in 2024. There are no such restrictions on eligibility in the Constitution under Article 2, Section 1, beyond being an American citizen and attaining the age of 35. But the leftists keep hammering, knowing these things full well. It's all smoke and mirrors, a dog and pony show at its worst. All right? As far as your friend's glee over the indictments, who gives a shit? You should remind your liberal friend that an indictment is not a pronouncement of guilt. We're not in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. It means nothing. Anyone can be accused of anything. It doesn't even mean that the grand jury is following the law with their approval to proceed to trial.
Yeah, I know that indictments can come pretty cheaply. They come up with false accusations all the time, knowing the charges are false.
Yeah, sure.
I think they've turned the process into the punishment. Win or lose, you're ruined. Their aim is to grind you down economically. But I don't think that's going to happen with Trump. He's got too many resources at his disposal and too much support from the public. He's not like General Mike Flynn or Bannon or Roger Stone. So, Dr. Tom, what do Italians think of all this? I mean, at least the people you interact with.
Well, the Italians, they really don't understand the American justice system. But I've had people here in Italy look at the U.S. and, well, you do realize that they're openly socialist here. In fact, they've been so conditioned that they don't even realize that they're socialists. And yet they think America has gone batshit crazy. They really think that they're nuts. I'm constantly questioned about what's going on in America because Italians distrust the information that they're getting from their mass media even more than Americans do. At least the ones that are rational and merely seeking the truth. They have an unquestioned history of being lied to by state-run media, So,
oh, well, yeah, I guess I was unaware of how Italians in general regarded their news media. What do you tell them about our politics? What do you say?
Well, I usually explain it to them this way. The first thing to understand about America is there are two major political parties, though this is not a condition of the Constitution. In Italy, there is a proportional representation and governance by coalition. If you have a certain amount of people, you can create a political party. So they've got 365 of them, So we don't have this in the United States, is what I tell them. No. Secondly, though there are only two parties, there are three major political philosophies: conservatism, liberalism, and progressive Marxism. Now, there is a big difference between liberals and leftists. But here's the thing. They both vote the same, and that's the confounding part. Why is it confounding? Because the true liberal may see a proposed act as a positive step in the direction of personal freedom and support the effort. Their emotional desire for a bill to pass may be completely sincere and with a moral conviction behind it to justify it. Leftists are cynical. The leftist understands that there are always unintended negative consequences to any act, no matter how good intentioned it is presented to be. They count on it. They also know that they can eventually obtain their aims by mission creep once they get their foot in the door with a seemingly benign act of legislation. Okay? They don't base their actions on morality or love of country or anything similar along those lines. They're only interested in the destruction of American values as well as the classical liberal values that have been enshrined in our founding documents. The true liberal is motivated by a love of country, just as the conservative. The leftist hates our country, but they use a thin veneer of liberalism to dupe actual liberals into voting with them alone. And if their motives be known, they wouldn't get anywhere, especially through the ballot box. I usually give them the example of this kind of deception using someone like Achille Occhetto. Achille Occhetto was the leader of the Italian Communist Party up until 1991. So in 1991, he goes to the United States, visits with Bill Clinton, and when he came back to Italy, he renamed the Italian Communist Party the Democrat Party.
I was unaware of that.
Oh, yeah. You see, at the time, the Italian Communist Party was losing seats left and right. People were just fed up with them. So what did he do? He hoodwinked them. He called themselves the Democrats. Oh, we're no longer communists. We're the Democrat Party. Right? So I have to reiterate that in the American landscape, a leftist is a socialist or a communist with long-term destructive tactics behind a cynical mask of liberalism. They've made it appear that their views have gone from fringe to mainstream in America because of what they've infiltrated and what they control. And it doesn't have to be a coordinated effort, like a bunch of guys sitting around a table assigning missions and methods. The effects of what they do are what we're interested in as examples. An Axios poll in 2022 found that only 42% of those surveyed, regardless of political affiliation, have a positive view of capitalism, okay? While 54% have a negative view. Now, mind you, they never define capitalism. So what we're looking at is that 54% have a knee-jerk aversion to the word capitalism rather than what it actually is. Worse, more than a third of millennials in the U.S. now approve of communism, while in a separate poll, the popularity of capitalism has plummeted since 2018, according to YouGov polling. Okay? Now, you and I both know that capitalism, the free market enterprise, is an economic system, not a political one, and that communism is a political system, not an economic one. Any conclusions drawn by associating these ideas as alternatives to one another is absurd, right? We also know that capitalism, exists under communism as it does under every other political system under the sun. We went over this in a previous episode.
That's right. We explained to our listeners that it was merely a question of where the money comes from, where it's invested, and who gets the profits.
Exactly. But many people don't understand that difference. I think we could safely say that rewriting or not teaching history, civics, and economics to today's kids has been a successful mission on their part.
Well, yes. Here's where I get concerned. None of this was even close to being viewed as mainstream 20 years ago in our country. I was mentioning to someone the other day that I thought conservatives have always been pretty consistent. If anything, conservatives have become more open to liberal ideas. In the meantime, however, liberals have bought into some radically crazy shit. He asked me to give him some examples. Well, where do I start? 50 genders, unlimited immigration, drag shows for grade school kids, abortion on demand up till birth. And he retorted that the far right is just as crazy. But when I asked him to give me some examples, he just went mute. I was waiting for him to mention David Duke, but I think most people realize that was 30 years ago.
30 years ago, right?
And now it no longer plays.
No, it doesn't play. But what makes you think that even David Duke was a conservative? But you're right. They really don't have an answer for that, because conservatives are not just as crazy. All right? Even the true liberals are not just as crazy. Leftists are the ones who are insane. Liberals are just being taken along for the ride and derided by association. Liberals are the ones the leftists hide behind, and whether they realize it or not, they're hated by the leftists who they shill for. Always remember that it is the Marxists that must regroup after their abject failures by redefining terms and by deceptive propaganda. But the views you just talked about still aren't mainstream. They never were, and they never will be. They are the views of a very narrow portion of ideologic Marxists playing the Hegelian game.
Dr. Tom, this happened so quickly. A Supreme Court justice afraid to define the word woman. 5 years ago, everyone would have laughed at the thought, but here we are. These were once just little changes at first, it seems to me, that somehow took over the entire country. My father, your uncle, he had a saying. In life, the first warning is a tap on the shoulder. The second is a punch in the face. Well, we went from laughing at these people to having to defend ourselves from them.
Yeah, I know, but my godfather's observation holds true on the streets of South Philly. But no, Rob, it happened very slowly. It's just that it has reached a critical mass within our lifetime and appears like a rapid expansion to us, okay? Because we went from one extreme to the other within our lifetime. It was recognizable. Well, here's your punch in the face. Yes, we're going to have to fight on every front. Education, news, sports, even entertainment, to get the country back now. And it's not going to be easy. Remember episode 18 when we discussed the psychology of totalitarianism? Here's a perfect example where a small portion of the population can form around an ideology and then take over a society. Right now, for instance, those who question the changes we see happening are labeled, ridiculed, marginalized, censored, their careers destroyed. They and their families are threatened with violence. So much for tolerance. Ask your liberal friends if these are the actions of true liberals? Ask them if they would do it. How do you think they would respond?
I don't know. I have trouble speaking with them sometimes. Okay, but how does all of it relate to America today? How did we get here?
Well, I don't think it's necessary to go through an historical review of politics or a timeline of events. We all know when it started. It started with the Progressive Era. And we're talking the early 1900s. You know, we are all aware of the divisions as they are presented in the media today. On the ground, however, I really don't believe the division is as it is portrayed. What is apparent is that the Marxist progressives have radicalized the Democrat Party. When I think of people like John F. Kennedy, his brother Bobby, both of whom would never be welcome in their party today, there's no question, or others like Joe Lieberman, or even more recently Tulsi Gabbard, being driven from their ranks, the obvious conclusion is that the party is corrupted. This was a long-term strategy from the beginning of the last century. It looks to me that they had to wait until the greatest generation had died off to push their actual objectives, through. They would have met too much resistance from the people who fought in the Second World War. You know, today they're actively trying to cajole the conservatives into a destructive civil conflict by small inflammatory instigations. Never take your eyes off the Hegelian dialectic. It tells you everything you want to know.
All right, Dr. Tom, it looks like you're going to have to go into a little bit of detail about the Hegelian dialectic. Could you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. Let's look at the Marxist playbook, okay? Let's look at Marxism from its original, let's say, embryonic beginnings to today, okay? Originally, Marx pitted the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, okay? In other words, the French terms for the workers against the middle class, all right? He claimed that everything, all of the strife in society was a perpetual class struggle, all right? His aims were international, and it didn't work. It failed. It couldn't even be applied to our country because we had no classes in the United States. We still don't, okay? It failed miserably. So then, after the First World War, Marxists like Giovanni Gentile here in Italy replaced the opposing groups for the Hegelian dialectic with a national struggle. This was the basis for Mussolini and Hitler, both Marxists, to create fascism and Nazism. This could not apply to our country either, because we weren't going to rise up against the individual states within our own country, right? This failed on the world stage. This was brought to an end by the Second World War. It was a failure. But it was obvious that the United States and its classical liberal values enshrined in our Constitution and cultural conservatism was an obstacle. It stood in the way of Marxist world domination. So now what? How do you think they responded? They started to erode the United States from within by replacing class and nation with anything else to foment turmoil with the aim of leading America to its destruction. They use race, they use religion, sexual orientation, revisionist historical perspectives, and so forth. It seems that the oppressor-victim dichotomy was the way to go. All you had to do was just plug and play. Even if the struggle didn't exist in reality and was purely imaginary, you could just alter history and predate the victimhood. Now, I have to repeat myself. None of it is the fruit of a liberal mindset. It is purely leftist.
Yes, we talked about this. I think it was in a previous episode about the past. Remember the Soviet saying, the hardest thing to predict is the past?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Dr. Tom, let me get us off on a slightly different topic. I've wondered why I consider myself a conservative while those around me, people I know well, people I've grown up with, same school, same neighborhood, similar experiences, family values, etc., people I love and respect. How can they think so differently? And so I guess I want to ask you, is there a personality difference that's drawn to each side? What is it in human nature that causes one person to gravitate towards one belief or another? Is there, say, a predictor of who will be on the liberal versus the conservative side? And how does say, family and religion play into those views? Long question.
Well, the first thing to remember is that they are two sides of the same coin, okay? The second is that people move between two categories, usually from left to right as they get older. They both love our country, believe in its founding. It's just that liberals are a bit confused nowadays, and I'll get to that. But, well, you're really asking me questions that fall into the field of of the clinical psychologist. We'd have to rely on them for the answers. Dr. Jordan Peterson claims that there is a difference in the typical personae of the conservative and the liberal. He's concluded that the conservative persona is low in openness, yet high in conscientiousness and orderliness. It is introspective, it's religious, pragmatic, polite, unsure, has high regard for moral values, and shows patience. They like to see borders around things, real or philosophical. They like to see things in the box where they belong. Okay, you get it? I would only add to this that American conservatives are not cement blocks impervious to change. Being strict constructionists, they want changes to follow proper reflection and proper constitutional procedures. The abolition of slavery is one of many perfect examples. They are not the knuckle-walking mouth breathers that the leftists have painted them to be. Somehow, leftists have convinced the liberals that conservatives are incapable of intellectual thought. They also the conservative also tends to be older and more mature. On the other hand, the classical liberal persona is high in openness, but low in conscientiousness and orderliness. They can easily identify things in society that need improvement, but they rarely ask the question, and then what, when pushing their rash proposals. Before they even realize the possibility of adverse effects, they're already on to the next cause. Though they tend to be a bit more rash and impatient, the leftists have convinced them that they are intellectuals and should be should be taken more seriously. Their formal education leads them to believe themselves to be more superior in matters of social change. That society needs their paternal guidance. I know more than you do, so why aren't you listening to me? Now, if I may add something of my own here, all right? There is no natural tendency towards violence in either of these broad categories. I'm talking about conservative and true liberal. They both share, from what I observed, an unfettered desire to be left alone to pursue their own interests. In my view, each of these perspectives has an important place in the national discourse. This is not the case with the Marxist left. Marxism has no place in America.
Dr. Tom, all that being said, I find it interesting that big tech is capitalizing on their knowledge of us and our personas. It's why you'll only see those memes and videos in social media and ads that you're likely to agree with. Now, I can see a danger in this because we each will have our own information, our news funneled to us according to our belief. To me, there's a threat that we'll be siloed into only receiving information that conforms to our view of the world. And that'll keep us from discovering the view of the other side. It'll keep us isolated from
Right.
each other.
Exactly. Especially when one side of that argument is leftist and tends to promote violence. You won't see any kind of violence by the right, right? Or the conservative. They don't do that. Okay? They uphold the rule of law. The use of the Hegelian dialectic rather than the traditional Greek dialectic is a Marxist tactic used to divide us into groups. I have to reiterate that Marxism needs to pit one group against another, and they have to create an oppressor and a victim to continue the perpetual social strife. There is no mainstream belief in the left's view, neither by the conservatives nor by the true liberals. It's un-American, and it always will be. To illustrate my point, let's look at leftist news disseminators. CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they're all losing eyeballs and money. Look at leftist marketing campaigns. Disney, Anheuser-Busch, Target, they're failing completely. So what does that tell you about America's choice of ideology? It tells me that what you referred to as mainstream isn't. It tells me when the left shows its hand, Americans of all stripes reject it.
Okay, so you think that liberals are confused and that they really don't embrace the left. It's just that they tolerate it. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure. They certainly don't seem to clarify their views as opposing Marxist ideology. They don't seem to mind being included by the leftists into their fold to the point that conservatives don't even make the distinction between them anymore. They're all liberals. Exactly what the Marxists have dreamed of, because it deflects from their culpability. They're holding them out as, look at the liberal, don't look at me.
Okay, right? Well, I just can't get this thought out of my head. You said that liberals are confused, but they're bright people just like anyone else. What's duping them?
Well, I think it may be a false notion of intellectualism. If you went to get a master's or a doctorate in the humanities field, in any humanities field, or enter into a profession, like teaching, you're likely to have more time and association with leftist thought to be lured in. It's a very subtle indoctrination. Chances are you're a good-natured, caring individual. That's part of the persona we talked about above. But here's an example of where this can go horribly wrong. Nazi Germany. At the beginning, the Jews came to accept the Nazis' ideology. They believed it was a passing fad and, it was so absurd that it would eventually peter out. They didn't believe Hitler meant what he was screeching about, but he did. He knew who his scapegoat was going to be right from the very beginning.
Dr. Tom, what did the Italians think about their Jewish community? What did they think of the anti-Semitic laws that they wrote?
Well, the Manifesto della Razza, which was codified into Italian law in October of 1938. Remember the date, October of 1938, was mere window dressing for the Nazi allies. They were never enforced until Mussolini's regime ended. And the Germans were retreating from Italy after the armistice with the Italian armistice with the Allies. In fact, before Claretta Petacchi was Mussolini's mistress, he had another. Her name was Margherita Grassini. Not only was she from a prominent Jewish family from Venezia, she was a major propaganda advisor to the National Fascist Party. She was also Il Duce's biographer. This woman had an influence over Mussolini's politics from 1922 until 1938. Up until that time, the fascist government's politics were not anti-Semitic, and the party's membership rolls were open to Jews. 30,000 of them enrolled. In fact, when Hitler came to Rome on a diplomatic mission of state in May of 1938, this is before October of 1938, Adolf asked Benito, "Hey, Benito, how many Jews you got in Italy?" Mussolini said, "We have no Jews in Italy." We've got Italians in Italy. So there you go. That tells you everything. Mussolini was not convinced. He was not a convinced anything. He was a thug. Hitler was absolutely convinced. Okay. Did you know that the oldest continual Jewish enclave in the world is in Rome?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's been in Rome for 2,000 years. Imagine that.
All right. Well, then if I'm getting your point, Dr. Tom, you're saying history has proven that you need to be careful with whom you climb into bed.
Yeah.
As you've stated, Jews wanted to get along with the German, Nazi, and Italian fascist collective power shifts. And so you're saying they and the other groups were then made the other when it came to time to assign blame.
Sure.
So what you're, I guess, intimating is that today's liberals are at some point also going to be classified, grouped, scapegoated, and then attacked if the left gets too powerful. So in effect, we'll all be classified, given names, climate deniers, old white men, anti-vaxxers, spaghetti benders. Hey, wait. Spaghetti benders, that's you and me.
Yeah.
But seriously, Americans don't believe that could ever happen here. You realize that, don't you?
Yeah, I'd ask them what makes them so sure. What I get a kick out of is how they try claiming that Italians aren't white. You see? Oh, yeah. You read these. When did Italians become white? It's a very lame attempt to get people of our descent to join in on the racist craze, our people couldn't care less about how other people view us. Did you ever notice that Jews and Italians are less in the population than African Americans, but we have absolutely no desire for a minority status? But you're right. That's what the Jews in pre-war Germany said when they tolerated the Nazis' rise to power. They refused to get the message even after Kristallnacht. If people don't think that kind of thing can happen in America, they shouldn't kid themselves. There was already an outstanding job done in the U.S. attacking anti-vaxxers, for instance. They became the other, the unclean, blamed for the continuing epidemic. They were ostracized, censored, made unable to travel, stripped of their livelihood, even threatened. I have to remind you that when the leftist gains control, they gain it through violence. They gain it through that, and they never stop the violence once they gain power. That violence will continue, and it will always lead to their downfall, but always after a lot of blood is spilled.
Threatened? Were we threatened in the pandemic?
Yeah, you remember when those who didn't want to take the shot were told that if they ever attempted to keep their job, dine out, or travel by forging their shot ID, they'd be fined or imprisoned.
Show me your papers. Your papers are not in order.
That's right. Yeah, Ausweis, Papieren. Danke, Papieren. You're exactly right. Remember when the kids without injection records weren't going to be able to go to school? Remember the discussions around denying life-saving care to anyone who hadn't got the injection? Has anyone ever apologized for that even today? Many people still believe it was all justified, for their own good, of course. That's the nature of totalitarianism. And let's state it clearly. Leftists never pay the consequences of the supposed intellectual failures that they push onto the public through government.
All right. Well, we have to wrap it up, but before we go, we always leave on a positive note. Hard to do that after this discussion.
Yeah, well,
but we try to give the cure for the issues.
Positive in this.
Yeah, well, we always try to give the cure for the issues we discuss. But we're running out of time, so I'll just tell our audience to tune into the Liberty Brief podcast, episode 18, to discover how we stop a totalitarian movement. All right. Before we go, let's test your theory. I'll name an institution or belief, and you tell me whether whether I'm a confused liberal or a leftist. How'd that be?
That sounds okay. Let's try it. Should be fun.
All right, first one. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, says their mission is to fight for liberty and from an oppressive government. I'm reading their website now. The ACLU dares to create a more perfect union beyond one person, party, or side. Our mission is to realize this promise of the United States Constitution for all and expand the reach of its guarantees. They take in the tough cases, where unpopular speakers or demonstrators are banned, like Louis Farrakhan or pro-Nazi groups. Now, are they liberal, as they state, or leftists?
Yeah, they pride themselves on upholding the Constitution. They're constantly suing the federal and state governments to protect our freedoms and to uphold our rights against government overreach, right? Yeah. But where were they when parents were intimidated by Biden's DOJ and tagged by the FBI as potential domestic terrorists for speaking up at school board meetings? Where were they when protesters at the Capitol were arrested and held without bail for even just being outside the building? Or when some nonviolent Capitol protesters were held in prison for months awaiting trial? Where were they when unarmed Mark Houck was arrested by a team of 20 SWAT police while praying outside a Pennsylvania abortion clinic last fall? Or when Roger Stone was arrested by 29 armed FBI agents, with guns drawn in a pre-dawn house raid on allegations he lied to Congress during the phony Mueller investigation? Where were they when Trump's attorneys were forced to testify against their client in violation of attorney-client privilege? Hard to think of more egregious violations of individual civil liberties. Yeah, the ACLU. They were, of course, nowhere. These people are leftists, posing as protectors of liberty. Their selectivity says all you need to know.
Okay, well, but I think you just made your point again about the fallacy that totalitarian police states couldn't happen here. Oh. All right, well, here's another one. What if I rooted for Bernie Sanders, an avowed socialist, in the 2016 presidential primary? Am I a confused liberal or a leftist?
Well, I wouldn't call Sanders a socialist. He's a communist, plain and simple. He said so himself. He spent his honeymoon in Moscow. He brags about it. If you voted for him because you couldn't stand Hillary, well, you have my sympathy. And you didn't have much of a choice there. And I, for all intents and purposes, at least you know what Sanders is. You also know what Hillary is, and that's why you wouldn't vote for her. You may just be a confused idealist or simply a conflicted liberal. On the other hand, if you think his ideas are the cat's meow, you're left of Mao. It's that simple.
All right, let's try this. Let's say I get my news only from CNN all the time. Am I a leftist or a confused liberal?
So you're one of the 15 people that still watch CNN? Okay. Well, until recently, I'd assumed that you lived in one of the 5,200 U.S. airports where CNN was hardwired to play 24/7 on every TV in the building, in the terminal, in the gates, the restaurants. And they still had no ratings, okay? They still have no ratings. No, you're a liberal unless you think Don Lemon is a genius, That being said, you'd get more accurate information watching the Cartoon Network, okay?
Well, Dr. Tom, liberals will say that about Fox News.
Well, they might be right, They might be right, but at least Fox has ratings. At least people want to listen to what, certain people have to say. But to tell you the truth, I'm not too crazy about Fox either. There are some voices on Fox on their platform that I value, but Fox doesn't have my loyalty. They've already shown themselves to be, completely hypocritical.
Okay, well, let's try this one. What if I think Trump is crooked Perhaps I despise MAGA. I think the Capitol riot was an insurrection and that Trump goaded these people to break in. But I have no problem with Antifa or the riots in all the major cities over George Floyd, which were needed to correct injustice in America.
Well, if you believe that about George Floyd, you are a leftist. If you think Trump is crooked, you're entitled to that opinion, but show me the evidence. The same thing if you despise MAGA. Give me a valid reason. If you can't, you're either a confused liberal or repeating someone else's talking points without thinking. Likewise, if you think Trump goaded people into the Capitol, you need to hear another point of view. Get your facts straight. Maybe have an honest conversation with someone, maybe a little bit right of Stalin, or get your information from sources other than the New York Times. But if you honestly believe that Antifa or BLM is a force for good and that violent rioting in the U.S. cities was necessary to correct an imaginary systemic injustice against minorities in America, you are a leftist, period.
Okay. What if I believe in abortion up until the moment of birth, gay marriage, and trans rights? What about that?
Well, let me start with trans rights. As far as trans rights go, they already have them as human beings. They already have them as individuals. You don't need to specify this group out. They're human beings like everyone else. They have the natural rights that everyone else does. You can believe anything you want. Now, if you believe in abortion up to the moment of birth and gay marriage, support it. If you believe in it, support it. Give them funding. Go out and, speak on their behalf. Just don't make it my business and make me pay for any of it. So if you believe we all need to pay for it, you want to steal from me, that makes it leftist. You see, it's the same thing with abortion. It's repulsive to me. To me, it violates all forms of natural rights, okay? But I am not going to sit there and want it outlawed and banned completely. Just don't ask me to pay for it, because when you ask me to pay for it or support it by enforced speech, then it becomes my business, and then I will object to it. It's just the same on the liberal side. Let's say someone comes up and says, hey, we have to recreate the Nazi Party in the United States, and we're going to take a portion of your tax money and we're going to fund them. I would expect a liberal to say, no, I don't want my money going to that group. And rightly so. I would say the same thing as a conservative, because the values that I'm trying to conserve are classical liberal values that are enshrined in our Constitution. They're not Marxist values. You see what I'm trying to say? We have a lot more in common than we have in opposition.
I get it.
I didn't want to go off on a tangent, but you see what I'm trying to say. This has been completely befuddled by the left. And it is confusing the water. It's just muddying up the waters.
All right, last one. Let's say I support letting immigrants come into the country unimpeded because I believe that we're a beacon of freedom for the world. Bring us your tired, your poor.
Yeah, finish it. Finish it. Your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It doesn't say your huddled masses looking to illegally violate our sovereignty for a free lunch, a hotel room in New York City, free health care, and free education for your children at American taxpayer expense, does it? Doesn't say that. Unless you keep the door to your own home unlocked or are inclined to invite these people to sleep on your lawn, you're just confused and maybe a bit disingenuous, like the folks, up in Martha's Vineyard. Remember that? We have a process for taking these people in. And your selective idea of compassion doesn't pass muster. You need to reevaluate. Even a liberal values the deed to his own home. Simply because someone is less fortunate than you doesn't give them the right to camp out in your living room and make himself a sandwich with your peanut butter and jelly.
All right. I think we're clear on that. Well, we're out of time today. Thanks again, Dr. Tom, for giving us a lot to think about. In our next episode, we'll be discussing justice in America. Why does it appear so lopsided? And what can we do about it? So goodbye for now, and until then, we'll see you next time. You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.